This video is sponsored by the new Ulanzi JJ06 Glide Go video tripod. Now, one of the first things that so many of us learn in photography is that our shutter speed shouldn't be too slow, otherwise our photos are going to be blurry. And shooting with shutter speeds of over 1/250th of a second or so will make sure that we don't have that issue and our photos will be nice and sharp. But shutter speed, just like aperture, is just as much of a creative effect as it is a functional one. So why don't we play around with it a little bit? Using slower shutter speeds in the right scenario can introduce some beautiful motion blur into our photos that can really help enhance the story that photo is trying to tell. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today in this video. And I'm going to show you guys a few different slow shutter techniques that you guys can try out as well. And before we jump into it, I'm giving away 6 of my favorite presets. There's a link down in the description, and I hope you guys enjoy. But I want to start this video off with doing a very quick rundown on the function of shutter speed, right? Shutter speed is one of the 3 settings in the exposure triangle, the others being aperture and ISO. And shutter speed impacts the exposure or the brightness of our image based on how long that shutter is open and how long your camera sensor is exposed to light. The longer that shutter is open, which means a slower shutter speed, the longer that sensor is going to be exposed to light, and that will result in a brighter image. And the faster that shutter clicks down, the less time our sensor is going to be exposed to light, resulting in a darker exposure. So a faster shutter speed means less light and a darker image, and a slower shutter speed means more light and a brighter image. That's pretty easy to understand. But the creative effect of shutter speed is its ability to freeze or blur motion. A faster shutter speed is going to freeze that motion in place, and a slower shutter speed can introduce some really interesting motion blur if your subject is moving fast enough through the frame. And this presents some really interesting opportunities for us creatively. Utilizing motion blur in our photography can really add so much to a photograph. It can really help you express the sense of movement or dynamism or energy. It can also make a scene look a lot more abstract or interesting, and it's great for capturing some of the details when you're out shooting. It can also make your scene look a little bit more raw or organic, which is great for things like portrait photography. That's something that I'm always trying to do when I'm shooting portraits, is to capture that kind of raw, realistic vibe in that photo shoot. And lastly, there's almost something moody or dreamlike about slow shutter photography. They can almost feel more emotional, and when you use it in the right scenario, you can tell a much deeper story with your photo or with a series of photos that you're shooting. So let's break down some of these slow shutter techniques that you guys can try. And first up is the good old tripod long exposure. And I like to talk about this one first because it's very accessible, and I think a lot of us experiment with this when we just start out with photography because it's fun and the images look cool. And the reason shooting with a tripod is so great is because it completely removes all camera shake from that camera. So your camera is locked down on that tripod, it's not moving at all, and that allows us to capture certain parts of our scene in nice sharp focus, the parts of our scene that aren't moving at all, and the parts of our scene that are moving, we can capture some really beautiful motion blur in those moving subjects. And we can do this at the extreme as well. Because our camera's not moving, we can use 5, 10, 30, even 5 to 10 minute exposures when we're using a tripod. We just need to make sure that the shutter speed that we choose is appropriate for the speed of our subject. So for example, I shot this photo with a 30-second exposure. And the reason why I chose 30 seconds is because I really wanted to get that motion blur in the water. I wanted it to appear almost like glass, but the ocean wasn't actually moving that quickly as compared to something like a waterfall. And in this photo, I shot this with a 2-second exposure, but because the water was moving so quickly through that waterfall and down the stream, we get just the perfect amount of motion blur in that shot. And if you compare it to a photo that I shot at 1/50th of a second and 1/125th of a second, you can definitely see the differences between these photos. If I had shot that ocean photo with a 2-second exposure, honestly, it probably wouldn't have looked all that different. Because that subject was moving slower, I really needed to use a slower shutter speed to capture that motion. Now, if you're shooting in a city, this is going to range drastically as well. If you want to capture the light trails from cars, you might need to use a 5, 10, or 30-second exposure to capture those light trails. But even shutter speeds of around 1 to 2 seconds is really the sweet spot for a lot of urban photography because it kind of creates this ghosting effect behind your subject. It introduces that feeling of movement in that scene without completely overdoing it to the point where there's no people in the scene at all because that exposure was too long and the people were moving too quickly through the frame. But one thing to keep in mind, especially when you're shooting with a tripod, is the longer that shutter is open, the more light is going to hit that sensor, and there might be a little bit too much light for you to realistically use a slower shutter speed, and that's where something like an ND filter comes into play. And if you do want to experiment with slower shutter speeds, especially if you want to do so during the day, you definitely need an ND filter. And I recommend the variable ND filters. I have a 2 to 5 stop variable ND filter and a 6 to 9 stop variable ND filter, and these will allow me to block incoming light so I can still use those slower shutter speeds to capture that motion blur in my scene. Now, of course, if you guys want to experiment with slow shutter speed photography using a tripod, you're going to need a tripod. And for the last few years, I've been using and recommending this super small carbon fiber travel tripod that I got from Ulanzi, and it's been amazing. So when they reached out to me and they asked to sponsor a video talking about their brand new GlideGo video tripod, I said absolutely, because I have nothing but good experiences with their products. And I've not been disappointed whatsoever with their brand new video tripod. This thing is incredible. And as a hybrid photo and video shooter, I need something that can do both of those things well. I want to be able to shoot photos and have a ball head and just be able to move it around and have a compact design. But I also shoot a lot of video for YouTube, so I want something that's multifunctional, and this tripod does both of those things incredibly well. It's made out of carbon fiber, which makes it super strong, yet also light and small, which is super important to me because I'm a travel photographer and I want to be able to throw this into my bag and not carry around a super heavy tripod. So I've been stoked about just the size and dimensions of it. And it also gets ridiculously tall as well. For reference, I am almost 6'4", and this thing gets almost as tall as me. And when you put your camera on top, it is as tall as me. So I can just look directly into the screen without breaking my back. It's also super quick and easy to set up, and it has a quick release plate that snaps into place with a super satisfying click. But those are not the things that make this tripod special. This thing has a ton of advanced video features that I've been using to shoot some B-roll for an upcoming video I'm doing on the Leica Q343. If you remove the center column, you can lie it horizontally on its side, and you can use that to slide the camera around in 360 degrees in any direction, making it easy to capture some super smooth cinematic B-roll. It also has some really nice dampeners in it as well, making it great for things like smooth panning shots, hyperlapses, and extending the head out horizontally also makes it great for top-down footage as well, which I've been using for my upcoming video. So if you are in the market for a new tripod, head down to the first link in the description to check out the new Ulanzi JJ06 GlideGo video tripod. Thank you so much, Ulanzi, for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. Now let's get back to it. Okay, so we've talked about tripod long exposures, but what about handheld long exposures, where we're actually holding our camera and using that to capture motion blur in our photos? Well, there's a few different ways we can do this. The first way is we actually treat ourselves like a tripod and we hold that camera as steady as we can. Maybe we're bracing ourselves on something, and that will allow us to do the same thing as a tripod, capture certain parts of our photo in sharp focus and other parts of our photo in motion blur, the parts of the scene that are moving. But you can take handheld long exposure photography much further than this as well. And that's why I always recommend just experimenting. Move with your subject, whip your camera from side to side, and just try out some different techniques. This is something that I really love to do with portrait shoots because it really does add that kind of raw and organic vibe to those photos. But just keep in mind that the faster your subject is moving, the faster your shutter speed should be as well. It doesn't have to be super slow to capture that motion blur effect in that image. For example, I shot this photo at 1/50th of a second, and that was slow enough to capture the movement in the scene because me and the model were both moving very quickly. But I just love how certain parts of the image are nice and blurry, while there's a little bit that's in sharp focus as well, so you still kind of know what's going on. Now you can get super creative with this as well, and one of the things that I like to do is just a hard pan from left to right, and that can create some really abstract and interesting photos that, while on its own it might not be the most interesting photo, but when you look at it in a collection of images in an album or an Instagram carousel, it just helps tell a much deeper story about that place. And I think it's a great opportunity to experiment with colors and shapes. There's a lot of different ways that you can use slower shutter speeds when you're hand holding your camera. You can try spinning your camera, panning your camera, whatever, just experiment with it. But there are a few more solid techniques that I want to talk about when it comes to hand holding your camera. And the first one is the tracking shot. Now the tracking shot is when your subject is moving across your frame from left to right and you are following them as they move through the frame, keeping them in the same part of your composition. And when you take that photo with a slow enough shutter speed, your subject is going to be nice and sharp, and the background behind them is going to be nice and blurry. And this looks absolutely epic in our photos, and it's something that I really like to do because it allows us to keep the focus on that main subject. When we're using a tracking shot, we're kind of turning the background into just a jumble of shapes and colors and light, and it really allows us to focus on our main subject in that scene. Now, if you haven't taken photos like this before, they can be a little bit difficult to get right the first time. Generally speaking, you should use a shutter speed of between 1/10 and 1/70th of a second or so, depending on how fast that subject is moving through the frame. And then you need to make sure that you're shooting with continuous autofocus. So your camera is continuously focusing on that subject while they're moving through your frame. And lastly, you should definitely be using a high burst rate as well. So when I'm shooting these, I'll shoot with a medium or a high burst rate on my camera. So as they're moving through your frame, you're taking a bunch of different images, and hopefully one of those images will turn out. But if it doesn't, you can try dialing in your shutter speed a little more. If those photos are too blurry, your shutter speed might be a little bit too slow. And if the background is not blurry at all, well, you probably need to drop that shutter speed down a little bit more. It often does take a few attempts to get it right, so if you don't nail it the first time, just keep trying. Now you can take the tracking shot one step further as well, and I like to call this the double tracking shot. And I don't know if that's what it's actually called, this is just the way that I understand it. But essentially, the double tracking shot means that you and your subject are moving together through space. So picture you in the back of a car and you're photographing somebody on a motorcycle, and you're both going 50 miles an hour down the highway. Well, if you shoot that photo at 1/50th of a second, or even slower at like 1/20th of a second, that subject is not going to appear to be moving in your frame, so they're going to be nice and sharp, and the background is going to have this beautiful motion blur that kind of fades off into the distance. So with a normal tracking shot, you can really only photograph your subject moving side to side, but with a double tracking shot, you can take that one step further and capture some super cool motion blur photos of your subject moving forward to backwards. But the place that we see this most often used is in automotive photography. For example, I shot this photo while sitting on the back of a motorbike driving down the beach at 20 miles an hour, and I would definitely not recommend this, but this photo came out super cool. One thing about this image, I wish that I had an ND filter, because I had to stop down all the way to f16 to shoot this image. I was already at ISO 100 and I couldn't use a slower shutter speed to capture a little bit more motion blur in this image, which I really wish that I could have. So once again, always carry an ND filter with you because you never know when you're going to use it. But the last technique that I want to discuss is the flash freeze. And this involves using a flash on your camera, like this flash here on the Fuji X100 VI. And if you're using a slow enough shutter speed and it's dark outside, you can freeze a subject in your frame who's not lit, and then you can move your camera around and capture a bunch of different light trails in that image as well. And I tried this out on January 1st. We were at a party and I was shooting the DJs, and it looks super cool. After you take that photo and you freeze that subject in the frame with the flash, you kind of spin your camera, move it around, and it just has this really cool slow shutter effect. Now, ideally in this scenario, you want your subject to be relatively dark before you hit them with the flash. And also you want to make sure that you have some practical lights in the background that you can kind of play around with when you're moving your camera around. Now, in terms of recommended shutter speeds, I think between 1 and 2 seconds is kind of the sweet spot for this type of photo. Now, there's definitely a lot of other techniques that you can try out as well. I know if you have a zoom lens, you can zoom in and out really quickly and you can capture motion blur that way. And I'm sure that there's plenty of other techniques that I missed as well. So if I have, please let me know in the comments down below, and I would love to try those out. But I want to close this video out with talking about some crucial tips that you should think about when you're shooting slow shutter photography. And the first one is to use this effect sparingly. It's not going to work with every image, and it's just another tool in our tool belt. So use it sparingly and use it in the scenarios where you actually think it's going to add something to your scene. Don't just do it because you think it's going to look cool. Do it because it's going to enhance the story in that image. Tip number 2 is oftentimes a subtle change is going to give you the shot that you want. And oftentimes you're not going to nail it the right way. You might have to try 2 or 3 times to really dial in that shutter speed to get the look that you want. So just slowly drop your shutter speed in increments and then evaluate those photos and see if you need to make any changes from there. Tip number 3 is that more motion blur isn't always better. There's going to be scenes where you shouldn't capture that much motion blur. And a good example I have here is I was shooting at night in New York City. And if you guys want to watch this video, I linked it up there. I shot all through the night on a snowy night in New York City. It was super epic. But I first took this photo at 1/15 of a second. And honestly, you can hardly see the snow in that scene because that snow was moving quite quickly. And because my shutter speed was too slow, it was almost completely blurring the snow out of that image. So I set my shutter speed to 1/50 of a second, and that was the perfect level to capture a little bit of motion blur in that snow, but still freeze it enough in time so you can actually see it, and that adds so much to this image. If you couldn't see the snow in this image, I think it would be a much less powerful photo than it is. But that's the gist when it comes to slow shutter photography, and I hope you guys found this video useful. And it's also super nice to be back here on YouTube. I've been gone for about 2 months. I've been traveling here in America, visiting my family, and also just reconnecting with photography. I think one of the things that's not discussed here on YouTube all that much is that it's really difficult to have a successful YouTube channel and also create work that you're proud of. Because when I'm out shooting, if I'm shooting photo and video, those are two different sides of my brain that are trying to work at the same time. And sometimes I just want to go out and shoot and connect with photography. That's my true love. That's the thing that has gotten me to where I am today. So I wanted to take a step back and kind of just focus on my art and capture some cool photos. But it's good to be back, and I have some more videos planned here in the very near future. But I really appreciate you guys supporting me here on the channel. More videos to come soon. I hope you enjoyed this one, and I will chat with you again very soon. In the next one, we're going to be talking about the Leica Q3 43. Beautiful camera.